And now I'd like to introduce Liam Clay, who's talking about the use of behavioural assessments in shelter environments to recognise behavioural problems and adoption suitability of dogs. Liam is a PhD student with the University of Queensland. Currently, his research involves evaluating the behavioural assessments conducted at the RSPCA. Prior to commencing his PhD, Liam previously completed his honours with the RSPCA, monitoring the stress and behaviour of canines over the first 5-day period post-surrender. Liam has been working closely with the RSPCA for 5 years while still partaking in his undergraduate studies, both in research and in work placement. During this time, he's found his passion in training, behaviour, and identification of behavioural problems in canines.
Yeah, well,
Do you still want me to move it? Or?
nah, it'll be right. I'll just read that.
Yep.
There we go. That'll work. Good afternoon. I can tell that everyone is asleep. One thing that is not on this title page or title slide is my email. So the email is clay.liam@gmail.com, last name.firstname@gmail.com. If you want to discuss anything with the behavioural assessments, I've been researching it for a while now, ever since I started honours and at the end of my degree in veterinary technology. I understand the different concepts of behavioural assessments, the difference between qualitative, quantitative. There's a whole bunch out there. Different shelters use different ones. We use it for different purposes, and that's what we'll go through today. And then Diana will go on to the more practicality of certain things. Okay, so I will discuss the use of behavioural assessments in shelter environments to recognise behavioural problems and adoption suitability of dogs. That's adoption suitability. So, I'm a sucker for quotes. And one of my favourite inspirational people of all time was William Wilberforce. He was a great man. He abolished the slave trade, or helped abolish the slave trade in the 1800s. And he was an activist for welfare. And he was one of the co-founders of the SPCA back in the 1800s. And these are two quotes that I just wanted to put forward today. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. And that rings a lot with the welfare industry. If we look at all the bad things that have happened with dogs or cats or any animals in the welfare industry, it helps us to move forward. It helps us to give passion and cause to what we can do in research or in shelters to make things better. The other quote there is, if to be feeling alive to the suffering of my fellow creatures is to be a fanatic, I'm one of the most incurable fanatics ever permitted to be at large. And I'm an incurable fanatic. Ever since I was younger, I've always had a passion for behaviour, whether it was humans and animals. And with behavioural assessments, we need to understand that we shouldn't be just looking at, in research, we shouldn't be just looking at animal behavioural assessments, because we have to understand the human context of what an assessment is for humans as well. And that comes about with the paper that was published the other year, no better than flipping a coin. And if we understand both the human aspects of assessments and animal assessments, we get a thorough understanding of what an assessment is and how we can move forwards rather than backwards, and whether the assessments itself are relevant. And the other quote that is not on there is one of my favourites, and it's, what is it? I'm too young to realise that certain things are impossible, so I'll do them anyway. I'm only 24. I am very young in this industry. It's doing a PhD. A lot of the older people, all my supervisors, look at me differently. But I try my best to uphold the certain morals that William Wilberforce once had and still has to this day. And it brings us together and closer of everything that we do as a community to help behaviour, shelters, to help animals rehomed and have a better quality of life. Okay, so my background is a Bachelor of Science, majoring in Vet Tech, followed by honours in canine behaviour and stress. My honours topic was in canine behaviour in the first 5 days in kennel behaviour, and it was assessing cortisol and stress and comparing the two to see if there was any correlations. If you want to know more about that, we can talk about it later, but that's not the topic today. I've been working with the RSPCA for 5 years with behaviour, the behaviour assessments, shelters, protocols. My passions are behaviour, behavioural problems, identification of behavioural patterns, and subtle cues. I also teach at the university, teach undergrads anatomy and physiology, neurology, that kind of stuff. Okay, so how many people in this room actually use a behavioural assessment? Can you raise your hand? Oh wow, that's a lot. Okay, so there's different purposes to each behavioural assessment. Some behavioural assessments are used for a pass-fail. Other behavioural assessments are used for information gathering tools. So first we need to understand what is a behavioural assessment. How do we distinguish the differences between each assessment? How can we justify using them? And how do we know what is the right one for shelters or other welfare organisations? And that is a resource that is dependent on resources in shelters, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the next slide focuses on the paper that was discussed this morning, No Better Than Flipping a Coin. It has been shed into the light recently that shelter assessments, or assessments in general, they're not really, I guess, they're not worth anything anymore. That's what the view is. But in this paper, it gives a contrary view to what an assessment is. And it focuses on different points. It focuses on a single subtest assessment, let's just say resource guarding, and it outlines whether that animal will pass or fail. If we focus on one simple subtest, we're not looking at the overall aspect of the animal. We're putting it into environmental variables. There are too many variables to account for, especially in shelters. If you take an animal out of, let's just say, a kennel block, and it's been sitting there for 24 hours and it hasn't gone out, and you do assessment on it, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to be highly aroused. It's going to be probably hyper-attached. If you leave it in a room by itself, it's probably going to have separation anxiety cues. The paper itself also did not outline the different aspects of aggression. As we said before, what is aggression? There are different types of aggression. There's resource guarding, there's predatory, there's offensive, defensive. You have to, as someone that is conducting a behavioural assessment, look at not only the descriptive view of what a behaviour is, but, as was stated just before, each behaviour and what the dog is portraying, each behavioural cue, got to figure out the context of the behavioural cues and go from there. You need in-depth analysis of what the behaviour is portraying. And most shelters don't do that. They normally do either qualitative or quantitative assessments. And it only gave light, and it used the false positives and false negatives of reoffensive rates in humans, which is understandable. It was an example, and it outlines that it only focuses on one assessment. A recent paper that came out this year was Modelling Personality, Plasticity and Predictability in Shelter Dogs. I love this paper. I am a sucker for this paper. And the reason why is because there is something we missed in research, and that was plasticity. Most of the time we don't count for the learning curve that dogs do. Like, with time, if you do an assessment straight up and do an assessment 10 days later, you still need to account for the plasticity of the animal. The animal's learning in a highly novel environment. It has different coping mechanisms. They're all individual animals. So if we're not counting for the plasticity, that really subtle variable, our data is going to skew and you're not going to get the right results. The other thing that came out of this paper was that it showed that we should be conducting assessments not on a single one context, highly novel test. We should be doing over a long period of time. We should be using in-kennel behaviour monitoring as the dog comes through. We should be doing not just one assessment, but different assessments over a longer period of time, as they use in human psychology to see if someone will reoffend. They don't just do it off a one single context assessment. They do it over a longer period of time. They can't let a human being out of a prison unless they know for sure that something bad's not going to happen. And it is shown in that previous paper, the reoffensive rate, the sensitivity and specificity, we're not good at identifying who will reoffend, but we still got to do it. And I guess that's where I'm coming from in regards to the behavioural assessments. It's up to us as shelters or rescue organisations to ask ourselves, do we want to do it? Do we have the resources to do it? And are we going to do it properly, or are we going to do it just to see if the behaviour itself or the behaviour of the dogs are rehomable? So at the RSPCA, they use many behavioural tools to help with dogs in their stay. Their behavioural assessment is not validated. I'm doing that slowly. Benefits of a PhD, do a PhD. Definitely, no, don't do a PhD. We use previous owner questionnaires, standard medical checks, and those we use behavioural observations in them as medical checks. We use in-kennel animal attendant observations, both behavioural cues and just a scaling system. We use the 12-point behavioural assessment. We use behavioural modification plans and continual in-kennel monitoring, and also further follow-up behavioural assessments. Now, the behavioural assessment is used to understand stable behavioural repertoire, adoption suitability, and behavioural problems. That's what we use at the RSPCA. And as you can see, to account for all these variables, it's hard to. So it's up to the discretion of rescues and shelters to actually understand that you may be doing this single context behavioural assessment, but are you accounting for the coping style of the animal? Are you accounting for the acclimation period to the environment? Are you leaving the dog in the environment too long? Are you placing it in a kennel block where there are other highly aroused dogs in that kennel block? Are you accounting for different interactions with humans? We need to account for the variabilities, especially in research. We need to account the variabilities when we're trying to understand whether we should use such a highly variable assessment, or whether we should change it and go to a longitudinal study. There are different types of behavioural assessments. One is qualitative and one is quantitative, as we discussed before in the previous presentation. One is more subjective, which is a qualitative, and the quantitative is more objective. Objective, we focus on looking at subtle behavioural cues. Is the dog wagging its tail medium? Is it low or is it tucked? Is it showing signs of fear in regards to ears back, body lowered, tail tucked, shaking? What is the animal portraying? I was given the task of going through the data of behavioural assessments at the RSPCA, and some of the information you see is you can't really work with. I'm a very, I guess, statistical person. I need pure data, numbers. I'm a very number-orientated person. And most of these assessments show that. But a lot of assessments use scaling methods. And in recent studies, it is shown that animal attendants are very good at using a scale method on 1 to 10 of what the animal's portraying, whether it's highly aroused, whether it's not aroused. But if they're trying to say what behaviours are displayed in regards to that high aroused, they're not good at it. If we use scaling methodology in behavioural assessments, yes, we can get an overall view of what the dog is portraying, but we need to understand that to get a thorough understanding of the animal, we need to go more in depth and understand the antecedents, the behaviour and the consequences of everything we're putting the dog through in the stimulation of the assessment. Now, there is one assessment on here, the socially acceptable behaviour, that does not euthanize their dogs. They did a study in 2015, I think it was, and they did the sensitivity and specificity of their tests. Most of the dogs that displayed resource guarding were rehomed, and the information was taken back a year later from the owners. And most of the dogs did not display the resource guarding, but most of the dogs that didn't display resource guarding did display it in the home. So we have that point of view that no better than flipping a coin was coming at. We're not really good at identifying certain behaviours in shelters. And these are the different subtests we use. There's about 16, and I'll quickly run through those. Cage presentation, exploration of room, attention, interactions, handling, startle response, toys. You get the understanding. Most of the people that have done a behavioural assessment or know of behavioural assessments understand these theories. If you want more understanding or talking about it, please come and see me. But the main purpose of what we're trying to see is the different aspects of behavioural problems. Separation anxiety, hyper-attachment, aggression, arousal, anxiety, fear. They're very broad statements. You can go into categories of those, but I'm running out of time. So, possible future studies that we're doing now with the PhD is behavioural assessments with previous owners, so we can understand the interaction between the previous owner and the behaviour displayed by the dog. And this normally happens outside of the shelter, so no novel sensory stimulation is caused. Possible foster behavioural assessment, so we understand how the dog portrays in a normal home environment with the foster parents there, and then a post-adoption assessment. In-kennel monitoring, which I strongly recommend to do, and it gives a thorough understanding of what behaviours are displayed by the dog in the novel environment. And the potential matching of adoptees using behavioural repertoire by the individual dogs. And as you can see, that's a rough PhD framework, which I'm doing. I've done the number 1 so far. I haven't done much at all. But if you want to understand behavioural assessments a bit more, understand the theories behind it and how to implement it properly, or how to step forward in future recommended ways, come and talk to me. Always there to learn something new. I don't know everything. I'm still young and naive. So thank you.